Tattoos, coded language, and secret hand signs were all discussed at a pretrial hearing today in the case of two men accused of killing a Jacksonville toddler. Kwame Richardson and Henry Lee Hayes are charged with killing 22-month-old Aiden McClendon in January 2016 as the toddler arrived home from his Head Start daycare. On your side's Ann Schindler joins us with more tonight. Ann?
Well, Judy, social media took center stage at a lengthy hearing today to decide just what evidence will be allowed at trial and what access will be given to media and family members. Today we heard testimony from two central people in this case, including a state witness, a former member of both of the two gangs at issue, whose rivalry prosecutors say turned into a citywide bloodbath. By agreeing to testify against his former friends, that witness's situation has become so perilous that prosecutors initially wanted to clear the courtroom during his testimony. Also discussed today, several videos posted to social media that prosecutors say were used to either bait rival gang members or taunt them after drive-bys. Prosecutors describe an ongoing gang war that resulted in at least 6 gang members killed and many bystanders caught in the crossfire, including 22-month-old Aiden McClendon. The judge declined prosecutors' request today to prevent media from being in court during this witness's testimony. As First Coast News attorney Jennifer Mansfield noted, the media is not the problem.
Media are not the people who are making the threats, and the case law provides that court should be as open as possible. So if you do restrict anyone, you should make it as limited as possible, and the media could be there to substitute for the public in general to still know what's going on.
Now, even though we won the right to be in court for those, we did agree to blur the man's image. The trial is now slated for July, and the final pretrial hearing is June 25th. Back to you.